Hi, this is Professor Dan Kernler again with a video, this time about our project. We're going to give you some hints and suggestions for the first part of the project. So, big picture of the project is it's a survey. You're going to write a survey, collect some data, and then analyze it, make some graphs, charts, and then do some statistical analysis toward the end of the semester. So the first part, just kind of get a rough idea. You want to talk about your population and what you want to collect about that population. So there are 4 components to part 1. First is to identify 5 variables, basically 5 questions, but you're not going to write the questions yet. We'll talk more about that in the next part of the project. But we'll give some specifics on the next page, but there are only 5 things you need to collect. So it's not a huge survey. You're not going to have this big thing that you're going to write, and it doesn't need to be about a huge question that you're going to answer either. You need to also identify your population. Who are you going to sample from? And then a random sampling strategy that should collect a random and representative sample from that population. One of the hardest parts about part 1 is finding 2 related studies that compare to your variables. I've got some suggestions, some sources, and then you can always just email me or stop by my office and we can usually find something that relates. There are some specific criteria though, and that's what makes it a little bit challenging. And then finally, you're going to state 2 hypotheses. After you find your 2 comparison studies, you're going to say, well, how do I think my population compares to those 2 particular studies? All right, so the variables. Remember from chapter 1, you've got 2 big categories of variables, quantitative and qualitative. Qualitative are just qualities describing someone. It's political season now, so it's political affiliation. It's do they support a particular initiative? It's their candidate. Just qualities thing there, nothing that you're measuring. And then quantitative variable, there's 2 categories within that, and you don't have to have one from each, but just to summarize, 2 quantitative variables can be discrete or continuous. So discrete are things that you count, like number of siblings would be things that you would count. And continuous would be time, distance, height, weight, things like that you're kind of measuring and you're rounding when you measure. So the requirements here. You have to have at least 2 quantitative variables, and 2 of the quantitative variables must relate somehow, or you think that they relate. Like height and weight for an individual probably relate. If they end up not relating, it's okay, but you have to have 2 quantitative variables. You'll see why in chapter 4 we're actually going to do some analysis of bivariate data when we have 2 quantitative variables. For number 2, you have to have 1 quantitative variable that can be compared to a previous study. And this is where this kind of focuses what people are going to look at, and you really got to start almost looking at the comparative studies first and then you kind of pick out your variables. So the key here, it's a quantitative variable, so when you're going to compare it, and I'll give you some examples in a minute here, it has to be an average or a mean that you're comparing to because it's a quantitative variable. And so that's going to specify that one. You also have to have a qualitative variable. Again, since it's political season, it'd be easy to use political affiliation as a qualitative variable, and then find some study that talks about percent of Americans or maybe percent of college students. While I'm thinking about these comparison studies, what's important about them is that they're the same variable, not that they are the same population. So you might be comparing your population to different populations, and that's totally fine. In fact, I remember someone, gosh, what was the variable? But it was something about high school students in Germany. And that was the comparison study they had. And that's fine. Then you say, well, what do I think about my population and how does that compare? The last here, because we're going to be eventually doing some graphs and charts, some pie charts, bar graphs, we want to have a qualitative variable that has more than just 2 bars or more than just 2 parts of a pie. So it has to have more than 2 choices. The only reason why is so it gives us a little more interesting graphs. So I've got some examples here. There are 2 examples. Every part of the project there's a link to 2 examples, and you can see my grading on them as well and some of my comments. They're not always perfect, so make sure you read those comments to see if there are some things that you should change. But here are some examples. You can see hours worked per week and number of credit hours enrolled. Makes sense that those would be related. This individual had an average number of hours worked per week that she found. I think it was 23, so there was a comparison study there. The degree plans was the other comparison study. So she was asking ECC students, do you plan to transfer, get a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, or are you just here for a certificate or an associate's degree, etc. Work time and then sleep quality, it was like a yes or no or something like that. So those are just some ideas. In terms of your population and sampling strategy, so if you recall, the population is all of the individuals that we're looking at. And then from that, we're going to select a sample, which is some subset of that. And there are two key characteristics that need to be true about this sample, or at least you need to try to make them true. They need to be randomly selected, and that sample needs to be as representative as possible. So this is important. If you do, we've got these different random sampling strategies that we did in Chapter 1. But if you do ECC students as your population, you can't just go to the library and walk up to people that look friendly and ask them. Because not everybody at ECC goes to the library, not everybody's at that time of day, and you're not being random at all. You need to somehow randomize it using some of the strategies that we identified. If you need some suggestions, some people get a little bogged down here, so maybe just shoot me an email or stop by my office. I'm happy to give you some suggestions. I want you to think about it first, though. I don't want to just tell you what to do. And some people come up with stuff that I hadn't thought of, so I kind of want to leave it open too. There was something else I was going to mention as well. Oh, your strategy doesn't need to be perfect. You're going to have an opportunity later to comment on it. If it ends up that your sample isn't representative, that's okay, as long as you discuss that. But you need to put in a good faith effort and have a good plan that you're going to try to make it as representative as possible. Final note here, I mentioned this earlier about walking up. Convenient sampling is not appropriate. You will lose a lot of points on the project if all you do is just go up in the hallway and ask people. You have to have some type of strategy that makes it random, and you have to somehow try to make it representative. So some things to think about there. Next part, the comparison study. So there's two parts to it, quantitative and qualitative. So you have to have one study, you have to find a mean or an average to relate to your quantitative variable. So that sample found that they had this sample from community college students that they work 23 hours per week. So on average, from this particular study, they work 23 hours per week. So that's an average. That's a very specific average. So you need to have an average like that. And then for the qualitative, you're looking for percents. So this particular student, again, found that 71%, from this other study, 71% of community college students said they planned on transferring and earning a bachelor's degree or higher. So then this student could then look at our population and say, well, what do we think about our community college students? Do we think they're going to be more or less than that? And kind of why do we think that would be the case? So this sometimes is the starting point for people. They get looking for the comparison studies first to try to identify, okay, do I have a project that fits here, and then kind of finishing out the rest of it. Last, you have to have your hypotheses, and basically you're saying, okay, I've got these two comparisons. How do I think my population compares to these? So this particular student is interesting. I put this in here, but the hypothesis is because most ECC students go part-time, they'll average more than 23 hours per week. But the other study was also community college students who also probably work part-time. So maybe not the best hypothesis, but I'm pretty liberal here that the idea is just come up with something, and then later on we will actually test it. So if you're not right, no big deal. We'll actually test it. If you're not sure, you can just say, you know what, I'm not sure. I'm going to test whether or not they're different. So I think they might be the same. So we're going to see eventually later on, we're going to do some statistical tests to see if they are different. So one final key here, let's look at the rubric to see how you're going to be graded. And I've got somewhere here, I have the window. So let me go back to the home page in D2L. So I'm here on the home page, and then content browser is over on the right. There's project, and then part 1 description. And you'll see all the details, a little bit more details, some more examples here about what to do. There's an outline here that you can download, that you should download and fill out, and that's what you'll be filling out, and you'll be uploading it to the Dropbox and posting it to the discussion board. So here's all the different parts, etc. And then there's a weird numbering. Just notice the weird numbering. Okay. There's the example links. Okay, so here's the grading. So the variable details, that's 5 points. Comparison studies, 10 points. Sampling strategy is really important. Again, part of the project is just a way for you to demonstrate what you have learned. This is just another avenue for you to demonstrate. Do you know what a population is? Do you know what a random sampling strategy is? Do you know what it means to be representative? And so this is just an avenue for you to do that. So that's up to 15 points. Your hypotheses are 5 points, grammar, spelling, etc., 5 points. And then I wanted to mention this last part. 10 out of the 50 points for each part of this project is do you reply to at least a couple of your classmates? And this is not like, hey, your project looks great. It's showing some depth that you read it, and if you found something interesting, what was it? Why did you like it? How does it tie into what we're learning in the course? If there was a mistake or something that wasn't right, be specific. Why didn't it fit the requirements, or what statistical concept wasn't correct? And so you're kind of showing some insight there. Again, this is another way for you to demonstrate what you understand, but the benefit of this is it also helps your classmates. If you catch something or if you like something, it can be kind of encouraging too. So this will be graded out of 50 points, and it's going to be 10% of the overall project grade, which is 15% of your grade. So project is a huge part of your grade, and each of these earlier parts are 10% of that overall project. There's a little note there about late submission that anything more than a day, anything late is at least 20% deduction, and then it's 20%, additional 20% for each additional day late. Okay, so that's that. If you have any questions, you can put a comment below or send me an email or post in D2L. I'm happy to answer. You can stop by my office. Sometimes it can be really frustrating, and just a 5 or 10 minute conversation can really get you on the right track. So feel free to do that as well. Thanks.